Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We apologize for those few technical difficulties. Once again, I would like to thank you for joining us for this year's 2020 lecture series under the theme Barbados to the World. And this afternoon's lecture is To Cuba and Back, Journeys from and to Barbados. And without further ado, I am going to reintroduce Dr. Sharon Marshall to continue her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Kay, for your introduction. Good afternoon. I also wish to thank the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for the invitation to be part of this lecture series. I'm humbled and honored to have been included in this lineup of eminent historians. And now to the presentation, To Cuba and Back, Journeys from and to Barbados. I'll introduce you to some of the Barbadians who migrated, their reasons for going, their life in Cuba, descendants who came to Barbados to live, and the circumstances which propelled them. Bonham Richardson tells us that after full emancipation in 1838, thousands of former slaves in the British Caribbean began to migrate from their home islands. They sought higher wages to bring back home or better living conditions elsewhere. In any case, by 1900, British Caribbean migration was a traditional means of black livelihood rooted in the region's plantation history. From 1891 to 1909, there were an estimated 15,820 male emigrants from Barbados. The number of females was given as 8,817 for a total of 24,637, according to the Barbados Blue Book of 1909-1910. In the post-emancipation period, conditions for working-class Barbadians were little changed from the era of slavery. For most of them, their lives were still tied to the plantations on which they labored as enslaved persons. In 1909-1910, agricultural laborers were earning between 8p and 1 shilling per day. Masons, tradesmen, and carpenters between 2 shillings and 2 shillings 6p per day, and domestic servants between 1 shilling and 8 shilling 4p per month. Some of the early destinations for Barbadians were British Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Brazil. These destinations have already been dealt with in previous lectures in this series, and Panama is coming up next. But I'll make some mention of Panama since the Panama and Cuba migrations are closely linked. Panama, particularly during the American phase of construction of the Panama Canal between 1904 and 1914, and Cuba during the phase of American investment in sugar plantations between 1900 and 1925. Some Barbadians moved on from Panama to Cuba, but many traveled there directly from Barbados. The ship's registers, which I examined in Havana, did not include data on nationality, but I suspect that the Maxwell family highlighted here were Barbadian. The Maxwells were listed among the women traveling from Panama to Cuba with young children on the 22nd of June, 1921. Mrs. Maxwell and her children were most likely going to join Mr. Maxwell in Cuba. Josephine Maxwell, 29 years, had with her children Eleanor Maxwell, 4, Clementina Maxwell, 3, and George Maxwell, who was 1 year old at the time. Remember the name Josephine Maxwell, as I'll come back to it later. So what were some of the factors which contributed to creating employment opportunities for British West Indians in Cuba? The Spanish-American War of 1838 had left the United States in charge of Cuba. Then the 1903 Reciprocity Treaty lowered the tariff on Cuban imports to the United States. American industrialists began investing in Cuba's sugar industry by buying plantations, particularly in the eastern part of the country. In 1906, American-owned mills accounted for 15% of Cuba's sugar production. By 1920, they accounted for 50% of the mills. By 1929, it had moved to 75%. So this labor-intensive cultivation of sugar provided a source of employment for Barbadians and other British West Indians. From the turn of the century, the hacendados, or landowners, had been pushing for the importation of labor, as is seen in this Diario de la Marina newspaper article, Faltan Brazos, or Laborers Lacking. And the article read in part, factories like Victoria and Narcisa have suspended their operations because of a scarcity of workers. Other sugar plantations are grinding only 2 or 3 days a week because they haven't been able to find cane cutters or loaders, in spite of paying them 10 or 12 reales, and sometimes more. The cane is being lost because there is no one to cut it. But many of the landowners favored white immigration from Spain and the Canary Islands. However, on the 3rd of August, 1917, President Mario Menocal approved immigration legislation which opened the door for the Black West Indians. It's estimated that between 1917 and 1931, some 300,000 Haitians, Jamaicans, and other workers from the Caribbean region entered the country to work in the sugar plantations, according to Alejandro de la Fuente in Immigration and Race in Cuba. Some of the individuals which would-be emigrants from Barbados would have encountered are G.S. Archer, who was a labor recruiter. Another, Mr. Nightingale, was also a labor recruiter. George P. Harding was the passenger agent for the Webster Steamship Company, while Hanschel and Company were agents for the Xavier Rumo line, and A.J. Hanschel was consul for Cuba. But they would have seen glowing reports in the newspapers, as well as hearing from some of the people who had returned, such as this Barbados Advocate newspaper editorial of the 23rd of October, 1922. Cuba is the greatest sugar country, and the estates of the Cuban American Company are the largest in the world. They are Delicias and Chaparra, situated on the healthy north coast, with hundreds of thousands of acres of cane fields, hundreds of miles of railway, 2 great mills, churches, schools, a town of 10,000 people, electric light plant, bakeries, marketplaces, theaters, clubs, public parks, hospitals, private wharves, a lovely harbor, good restaurants, a large concrete hotel equal to any in the capital, and in fact, every comfort to be found in the largest city. One of those who was enticed to go was Rufus Hoyt. He left for Cuba on the 23rd of January, 1925, at age 18. He would remain there until 1968. Rufus was determined to go just to get some of the silk shirts which his neighbor, Mr. Licorice, used to bring back. He managed to make the trip despite his mother's objections. Rufus, unknown to his mother, had got a permit from the agent, a Mr. Nightingale, and announced to her that he was going to Cuba the next time the men from his village were going. His mother was having none of that, and took the permit back to Mr. Nightingale and got back the money, a guinea, or 21 shillings. But Rufus was undaunted. The morning when Licorice and the fellows were leaving, he got his mother's permission to go down to the wharf to see them off. Well, after he'd gone, he told me, I felt so lonely. So the same fellow Mitch that had the boat, that carried them on the boat, I know him too, Mitch. I said, Mitch, come here, man. Give me a tour outside to the ship where the boys is. He said, well, get in. So the detective now on the gangway where the people going up, I tell him, carry me round to the back. So he carried me round to the back of the ship. And when he carried me to the back of the ship now, in those days, you know, the ship tall, but they had a rope.
I hold up on the rope and I climb up on the ship, gone right up. I still look like I go home, tell my mother gone to Cuba.
Others left by more conventional means. Earl Alonzo Panama Graves was born in Panama on the 2nd of September 1913 and brought to Barbados by his parents at 6 months old. He left Barbados with his mother and siblings in 1925 to join Mr. Graves, who had migrated to Cuba and was living in Ciego de Avila.
I remember good. When Mama decided that after that morning, we're going down tomorrow, we are preparing to go down tomorrow to go to Cuba. We start from St. George, from St. Philip's. Family come down to meet us, and take us down to the wharf.
Well, when they arrived in Cuba, they traveled by train to get to Ciego de Avila. But Mr. Graves wasn't expecting them at that time, so he wasn't there when they arrived at the station. Panama says, and after that, a few minutes after, a gentleman passed by, and my ma says, "Joseph Goodrich? That's you? Joseph? Joseph. Miss Graves, wait. What are you doing here?" "No, man, I just come down." "Lord, Miss Graves." They had meat from Panama in those days, but they didn't expect to meet one another there, you see. That's how the world worked, like that. And I tell you, Papa can't be found around there at that moment. There was a little bar in front there, Mr. Lord's bar. He was a Barbadian. He was from St. Joseph, and his wife was a Jamaican. And they give us something to eat because we're hungry, traveling the whole day on a train like that, going down to Havana, And Mama didn't have much, and she was weak and so forth, and we was hungry, and they give us food. And the gentleman say, "I'm going to look for Mr. Graves." And then they find Mr. Graves. And when Mr. Graves was coming to us, Mama says, "Look, your father coming there." And he said, "Oh, Lord, look at my children. Look at my children." And he started to cry. Santiago de Cuba was the principal port of entry where the immigrants had to be quarantined for 15 days. Many of the Barbadians settled in the eastern part of Cuba in places like Santiago, Guantanamo, and near plantations in Manatí, Chapara, and Banes. In the center of the country, Central Baragua was a major location for the Barbadians, and then to the west, Central Hershey and Havana. Some segments of the Cuban population were not welcoming. The West Indians were accused of driving down the wages of Cuban workers and described as being promiscuous and the fruitful cause of every kind of disease, and there were robust exchanges in the press. In the letters to the Post column of the Havana Post of the 24th of July, 1924, someone who signs off as a Jamaican from Guantanamo wrote to the editor in reference to the newspaper's inclusion of an item from El Mundo newspaper entitled "Immigration and Colonization." And he wrote, "If the Cuban people desire any particular class of immigration to come to their country, it is, of course, up to them to have what they want. If they prefer those who once held them down in darkness and tyranny to now become their comrades, no one is justified in questioning their desire. But those who have shared up to now in the development of this country, materially, morally, and socially, are people who can by no species of reasoning be set down as inferior to Cubans, should not be insulted in so slovenly a way as El Mundo has done." A few days later, there was a letter from a Raul Piedmont in Havana who had a retort for the Jamaican letter writer. His letter was carried in the Havana Post of the 29th of July, 1924, and it was headlined, "Cuban Answers Jamaican's Defense of Immigration." Piedmont had two main grouses: their Britishness and their transitory status. He wrote of the Jamaicans who apparently think that their British masters have transferred to them some of their Anglo-Saxon superhumanism. It is most distressing to have them think that for the simple reason that better wages are paid here than in Jamaica, they have a right to come here just because their names are Tom Jones or Ari Smith and not Juan Alvarez or Pepe Fernandez. He wrote, too, that the fundamental and, broadly speaking, only just objection to Jamaican immigration is that he is a seasonal laborer who takes what he can get and takes it out of the country. But the British West Indians made the most of life in this hostile environment. They created institutions such as the British West Indian Welfare Center in Guantanamo, the Caribbean Association of Cuba in Havana. They also established fraternal lodges, churches, schools, social clubs, cricket clubs, even a West Indian Workers' Union, and they were very active in Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which had 52 chapters and divisions in Cuba. They also became property owners, as is evident from this table, which lists British West Indian property owners who had been affected by the 1926 hurricane. And you have Arnold Wood from Barbados. Mr. Wood had land valued at $800, and he owed $500 on that. The house was valued at $900 and had been paid off. Nathaniel Smith, also of Barbados, had land valued at $1,000, and he still owed $828 on the land, but the house valued at $1,000 had been paid for. And then there's Aubrey Lowe, and the British Charge d'Affaires noted that this man has paid for his land. The house was a wooden structure on masonry piles and was blown over, but it can be reconstructed, but it will require considerable expenditure. Some of the other families who went included the Lord family. Elena Lord wrote to me from Havana in 2012, I think it was, and no, 2002, and she said to me, "My dear papa was born in Barbados and emigrated to Cuba when he was 16 years old. He wanted so much to get back to his homeland that he instilled his yearning and love for Barbados in his children." The Yearwood family also went. Vivian Israel Yearwood was born in St. Lucie on the 11th of June, 1903. He left for Cuba in 1922 at age 19. Like other Bajan countrymen, he initially found work in the sugar industry, but it was as an English teacher that he would become known in Victoria de las Tunas and in Manatee. He was called simply Teacher. Mr. Yearwood never returned to Barbados and died on the 5th of January, 1981 in Santa Cruz del Norte. We also had the Best family. Joseph Nathaniel Best was born in Belle Plaine, St. Andrew on the 1st of July, 1901. He migrated to Cuba in 1921, settling initially in Puerto Padre and then in Manatee. Mr. Best later moved to Las Tunas, where he remained until his death in 1978. His daughter, Dr. Aleida Best Rivero, became assistant professor and president of the Chair of Caribbean Studies at Las Tunas University. When the first elections for the National Assembly of People's Power were held in 1976, she was elected as a delegate and served for 25 years. She also served 2 terms as a member of parliament from 1998 to 2008 and was part of the provincial direction of the committees for the defense of the revolution. The Marshall family. My maternal grandfather, Isaac Newton Bonnie Marshall, was born in Ben Hill, St. Andrew on the 7th of June, 1880. He migrated to Panama, arriving at Colon on the 3rd of December, 1906, on board the SS Solent. As a blacksmith, he found work on the construction of the Panama Canal. My grandmother, Miriam Delsina Lawrence, was born in Market Hill, St. George on the 24th of August, 1884. Bonnie returned to Barbados and married Miriam at St. Augustine's Chapel on the 9th of December, 1907. They later left for Panama and then moved on to Cuba, where he became chief smith at the sugar factory in Central Hershey. Mr. Ince was his second in command. Central Hershey is about 35 miles east of Havana. It was one of several plantations in Cuba owned by American chocolate manufacturer Milton S. Hershey of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and was the headquarters of his Cuban operation. The sugar mill was completed in 1918 and began grinding in January 1919. there was a private electric railway to transport the sugarcane. At Central Hershey in 1923-24, field laborers earned $1.20 per day. By 1925-26, it remained the same, but by 1927-28, it had been reduced to $1 per day. Cane cutters got $1.40 in 1923-24 per 100 canes cut, and by 1925-26, that had been reduced to $1.25. By 27-28, it stood at $1. The mill laborers received $2.23. By 1925, it had been reduced to $2.09, and then there was a slight increase in 27-28, where they received $2.17. The sugar boilers received $7.50 per day in 1923-24. By 25, that had been reduced to $5.77 and $5.54 in 27-28. The centrifugal tenders received $4.10 per day in 1923-24. 25-26, it was reduced to $3.75, and by 1927-28, they were earning $3.26. Central Hershey was a carefully planned town which featured amenities like a power plant, water supply, a clinic, a hotel, churches, schools, swimming pools, baseball fields, a golf course, and housing for the workers. My mother and her siblings lived on 13th Street with their parents, and my mother recalls something of her childhood days there. She told me that other West Indians used to come from Baragua and different places. They came down on Saturday nights and played cricket on Sunday, and then they left on Sunday nights to get back home to their jobs on Monday. And sometimes cricketers from Hershey would visit other provinces in turn. They came from Camagüey, Pinar del Rio, Matanzas, Santa Cruz, and Havana. Almost every Caribbean island was represented. They stayed with different families. On these occasions, large tables were laid out with food, homemade drinks, and cakes. We cooked Barbadian food. Well, my mother cooked Barbadian food because I remember one of the guests writing her and telling her that he still had the taste of her gravy on his tongue. Many Barbadians settled in Central Baragua. The American-owned Baragua Sugar Company leased land to build the factory in 1916, and the first harvest began on the 31st of January, 1917. Barbadians took leading positions in operations at the sugar factory in Central Baragua. The Central operated 3 shifts, and at one point in the factory's history, there were Barbadians in charge of each shift: Mr. Lowe, Mr. Maloney, and Mr. Roach. These gentlemen were members of the Christian Mission Church there. The Nelson family also came to Baragua. Oliver Sylvanus Nelson was born in Barbados and migrated to Cuba in 1920. He settled in Baragua, where he met and married another Barbadian, Clotel Eunitha Springer. Her parents had taken her to Cuba from Panama. Mr. Nelson became a property owner and founded a newspaper. He was Grand Master of Cuba District Grand Lodge No. 1 of the Masonic Lodge, and they became parents to 2 boys and 8 girls. Neither he nor his wife returned to Barbados. He died in Cuba in 1959 and she in 1967. This is Elliot Nelson, one of the Nelson's sons. He's pictured here with the first resident ambassador for Barbados in Cuba, Donna Ford. Elliot moved from Baragua to the capital and worked for many years at the British Embassy in Havana. Long before Barbados established an embassy in Cuba in 2010, Elliot was an unofficial honorary consul for his parents' birthplace. He would welcome groups of visiting Barbadians, find accommodation, make connections, offer advice, and take visitors around in his vintage American car to get their business done. He died on the 17th of December 2019 at the age of 1985. Celia Leonora Campbell Jones was born on the 13th of February, 1906, and lived with her grandmother at Reese Hill, St. Thomas. On the 8th of August, 1920, she left Barbados at age 14 to join her mother in Baragua.
When I came here, all here was clean field. Down in Barbadian town was tree stump. The Barbadian, Jamaican, plenty of the nation came here, and all those stumps they cut down.
The Atwell and Green families also went to Baragua. Maradel Atwell Green was born of Barbadian parents in Panama. When she was 6 years old, her father, Joseph Nathaniel Atwell, left the family to go to Cuba. In 1920, her mother left Panama for Cuba with Maradel and her two sisters to join Mr. Atwell in Baragua. She recalled that there was always some excitement in Bajan town where they lived.
A man got beaten up and that sort of thing, and although the man-woman curse all night, she still can't find out who beat the man. Bajan people, they live together well outside, better than here. Wouldn't tell on one another.
Some of the Barbadian surnames to be found in Baragua during its heyday were Adams, Atwell, Bascom, Belgrave, Best, Bovell, Brathwaite, Brown, Butcher, Carrington, Carter, Catwell, Collymore, Conlift, Eastmond, Edgell, Elcock, Ford, Gaskin, Gibson, Gill, Goodridge, Green, Greenwich, Griffith, Harewood, Holdip, Howard, Hunt, Jones, Jordan, Lashley, Licorice, Lowe, Maloney, McLean, McCollin, Medford, Miller, Nelson, Osborne, Paris, Riley, Roach, Scantlebury, Springer, Stanford, Stout, Thomas, Weeks, and Whitaker. The migrants passed down aspects of their culture to the new generations born in Cuba. And in Baragua, every 1st of August, there is a celebration. I'm indebted to Dr. Stefan Walcott, who visited Baragua in November 2012 and shared this video online. I need to go back, just what I was. So here we go. Now, the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay provided another source of employment for Barbadians and other West Indians. Some migrated there from other parts of Cuba to find work. Anticipating U.S. participation in World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt visited in 1939 and ordered ordered major expansions that would allow it to operate as a port for air and sea patrols. Barbadian descendant William Hope was one of the persons who found work at the naval base, as you can see from his Death Benefit Association card, and he lists his beneficiary as Irene Justis de Hope, his wife. William's father, Edmund Lee Hope, had been born in Warner's Christ Church and baptized at St. David's Chapel in 1868. He left Barbados for Haiti, Canada, and then settled in Cuba. Mr. Hope set up a tailoring establishment on Aguilera Street in Guantanamo City. The sign above the shop reads, British-American designer and cutter, E.L. Hope. But the best advertisement for his services is a very dapper Mr. Hope standing proudly in the doorway of his establishment with his Haitian wife, Lydia, and their children. Young William is in the center, and he's flanked by his brothers Herbert on the left and Theodore on the right. Some other residents in Guantanamo were members of the Mechanics' Lodge, and these included Charles Linton, who was born on the 10th of January, 1895. His place of birth was given as Christchurch, Barbados, and he listed his next of kin as Michaela Linton, his wife. There was also Cyril Howell, born on the 23rd of February, 1897, in Clifton Hall, St. John, Barbados. His next of kin were given as Ina Howell, his wife, and his mother, Rebecca Howell. Having dealt with the outward migration and experiences in Cuba, I now want to spend some time on the return journey. I've identified 3 periods during which Barbadian migrants or their offspring were prompted to return home from Cuba or to come here. The first, 1930s, 2, 1960s to 70s, and 3, the late 1990s to 2000s. So what were some of the reasons to leave Cuba in the 30s? The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act increased the duty on Cuban sugar, and sugar production dropped 60%. Cuban exports declined by 80%, the price of sugar fell by over 60%, and the sugar harvest was reduced to 32 days. In 1931, legislation was enacted to curb immigration to Cuba. On the 8th of November 1933, La Ley de 50% required that 50% of the labor force be Cuban nationals. And Decree 2232 of 1933 authorized forced repatriation of foreigners who were without work or resources. Then there was also unrest, the revolution which overthrew Menocal. In March 1935, a general strike rocked the island and its main industry, sugar. My maternal grandfather, Bonnie Marshall, died in Central Hershey in 1935. My grandmother, Miriam, left behind 2 older daughters who had started their own families in Cuba and returned to Barbados in 1936. With her, she brought her 5 younger children, including my mother, Dulcina, who was then 9 years old.
So that first night we didn't go to sleep at all. We all crowded around our mother crying, saying we want to go back to Cuba. And she said, no, we can't go back, that we're here to stay.
Ophelia Nichols, Paris, as she was then in 1936, came to Barbados in 1936 as well. Her parents came from Baragua with Ophelia and her brother Reuben. She was 12 years old at the time. Ophelia celebrated her 95th birthday on the 11th of December, 2019. The Philo family. Frank was born in Baragua on the 5th of August, 1927. He first came to Barbados as a babe in arms, was taken back to Cuba, and returned in 1937 with his mother and brother. He later migrated to England in 1956 and worked with British Rail for 40 years. Frank celebrated his 92nd birthday in 2019. British consular and diplomatic authorities in Cuba were expected to represent the British West Indians, who were, after all, subjects of the empire. They had established a relief fund to provide for destitute immigrants, But by October 1949, when it appeared that the funding was going to be cut, the British were pushing repatriation. They sent circulars to 27 British West Indian centers in Camagüey and Las Villas provinces, urging the immigrants to apply for repatriation. And they listed Barbadians over 60 willing to be repatriated to Barbados. And I want to call your attention to this highlighted area. Martin Luther Hunt, 69, he had his birth certificate, and Martha Hunt, 76, she had a passport. And on this slide, indicating Barbadians under 60 asking to be repatriated to Barbados, we have Cyril A. Rowe, 39, who also has his baptismal certificate and his birth certificate. He's the son of Martha Hunt above. Now, reasons to leave Cuba in the 1960s and 1970s. In 1959, there was the revolution which brought Fidel Castro's regime to power. And Max Azikri tells us that strong pressure was exerted upon the population to show oneness with the revolution, not just in words, but in action. From the government side, it was particularly urgent to enlist the population in the works of the revolution, creating a close identification between the leaders and the masses. That requirement didn't sit well with everyone, and Azikri says that for some, it provided an additional reason to emigrate to the United States or elsewhere. For Barbadians, that elsewhere was home. The plight of the emigrants occupied the attention of the home government. In March 1961, Cameron Trudeau said in the House of Assembly, "I understand now that there is on a very large scale a certain amount of persecution of those West Indians who, for one reason or another, cannot come to terms with the Castro regime. I regard it, therefore, as a very serious matter, the idea that there should be West Indians, especially Barbadians in Cuba, who are suffering any sort of disability." Gilbert Rowe came to Barbados from Baragua at age 13 in 1970 with his father, Cyril A. Rowe. The same Cyril A. Rowe who was listed by the British as asking to be repatriated back in 1949. He was also accompanied by his mother, Elsie, brother Calbert, and sisters Adela and Wilma. They traveled via Mexico and Jamaica to reach Barbados. It's not clear why Cyril Rowe didn't leave Cuba until 1970. But Gilbert remembers quite vividly when the family received permission to leave. He told me, "There was this gentleman that used to tell my father, 'Cirilo, está aproximando el viaje.' Cyril, the trip is getting closer." Because they knew that we had applied to leave, and he would always tell my father that. I'm yet to know whether it was pulling his leg or what. But I can remember when that cable came as a child, because a man on a motorcycle used to come up, deliver the cable to you. You were given permission to leave. You had to leave the house instantly. Not tomorrow, you leave the house and they seal it. It was now the property of the government. So we slept by Granny, my grandmother, that born in St. Philip, Coley Kane, as they used to call her. Her full name was Georgina Coltrus Kane. Gilbert would go on to produce the Barbados Jazz Festival, bringing international headliners to perform at the festival. The Goddard family also returned to Barbados. William Nelson Goddard came from Pito Cuatro in 1970 with his father, Ethelbert Beresford Goddard. They traveled via Mexico and Jamaica, that familiar route, to reach the island of his father's birth. His mother had remained behind in Cuba with 3 boys and 2 girls. A year or 2 later, his mother came with one of her daughters, Evelyn, leaving the older children. The Niles family, Nathaniel Niles, was able to return to Barbados in 1969. He brought his wife, Francesca, and daughters, Idania and Graciela, from Guantanamo in 1973. Graciela is a facilitator in the primary Spanish program. In 1971, Mrs. Josephine Maxwell wished to return to Barbados with 4 grandchildren. 2 of them were 17 years old, one was 19, and the other was 22. They had been born in Cuba. She appealed to the Barbados government for repatriation. As a Barbadian, Mrs. Maxwell was eligible for government assistance, but not her Cuba-born grandchildren. So a solution was found. Errol Barrow revealed in the House of Assembly in March 1971 that she will not come back without her grandchildren. She says she will not leave her grandchildren to be exposed to destitution in Cuba. So we have got the nephews in Christchurch to guarantee repayment of a loan of $2,520 to the Barbados government. And we have recommended that Mr. George Eliezer Maxwell should enter into a legal undertaking to repay to the government the amount advanced, the first payment to be made immediately after return of the relatives. Could this Josephine Maxwell be the same one who sailed from Panama to Cuba with her 3 children in June 1921? She was 29 at that time, so this would make her 79 in 1971. I'm so curious about what happened to Mrs. Maxwell and her grandchildren, but the document trail hasn't led me anywhere so far. Reasons to leave in the 1990s and 2000s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which ushered in a special period in time of peace in Cuba. Cuba's capacity to import shrank by 75%. The GDP was reduced by at least 35%. Exports reduced by 80%. Hundreds of factories were closed, and tens of thousands of Cubans were unemployed. Oliver and Clotel Nelson didn't return to Barbados from Baragua, but their daughter, Yolanda Nelson Springer, came from Cuba in 1994. She joined her older sister, Gloria, who had come after their mother died in 1967. Yolanda is employed as a facilitator in the primary Spanish program. Teacher Vivian Yearwood never got to see St. Lucie again, but his children, Florencia, Juana, and Ernesto, came to Barbados to reclaim their roots. The 2 daughters came in 2000 and were employed as facilitators in the primary Spanish program. Juana has since retired. Ernesto arrived in 2003. Edmund Lee Hope wasn't able to return to Barbados. He died in Cuba on the 17th of September, 1946, at the age of 69. But his grandson, Pedro Hope Justis, William Hope's son, came to Barbados from Guantanamo in 2000, and he is head of the Modern Languages Department of a secondary school. I met Pedro on a research visit to Guantanamo in 2000, and for better or worse, I'm now part of the Hope family. Some of the descendants have been able to visit Barbados to try to locate relatives. Among them, the filmmaker Juan Enrique Bocalandro Burton. Juan Enrique's grandfather was from St. George, and Juan is the creator of Lost Roots, a documentary chronicling the story of Cubans of Barbadian descent. And he told Loop News Barbados in 2015 that I have received good comments from people that have seen the documentary and were surprised to know that there was a community of Barbadians in Cuba. I would like for people in Barbados and in other countries to know about this film so that Barbadians around the world might know of our existence. Some have come to stay for a few weeks, while others are settled in Barbados and have formed a Cubajan community. They keep in touch with relatives left behind in Cuba, visit as often as their budgets allow, and send remittances in much the same way that the early migrants sent back to Barbados. This circle of outward and inward migration has joined Barbados and Cuba for more than a century to the benefit of both countries. Long may it continue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall, for that absolutely wonderful lecture. I was watching the online contents while Dr. Marshall was doing her lecture, and there were lots and lots of positive comments about what an engaging lecturer she was and how wonderful the material and content was. What we did not really get was any questions, so we're still encouraging you to please ask questions. She's looking forward to answering any queries that you might have. I am, of course, going to pass on all your lovely and wonderful comments about what a great lecture she's given, but I'm sure that if you have any questions, now would be the time to ask. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall.
Okay, there's a question from the audience. Our one audience member, who is the cameraman in these times of COVID-19 and physical distancing.
You had mentioned, can't remember which port it was, but
Santiago de Cuba.
When they arrived, they had to go into
Quarantine for 15 days.
Was this a result of the Spanish flu or something like
No,
that?
this was because these were black immigrants coming from God knows where. So they had to pay a deposit, in fact, to be quarantined. And if they passed the quarantine period, they would get the deposit back. But sometimes they were cheated out of that deposit and were sent on their way and didn't get their money back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you then. If there are no further questions, once again, I want to thank the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for this opportunity. Oh, there's a question coming in.
Where in Cuba did West Indians settle?
Oh dear, I had shown a map with some of the areas and indicated previously that it was primarily in the eastern part of the country. They were in Guantanamo because of the U.S. naval base, which provided employment. They also, during the period of sugar cultivation, settled in places like Manatee, Banis, Camagüey, where there was sugar cultivation, and the star of the show, Central Baragua, where there is still a large British West Indian community or descendant community.
Okay,
And Central Hershey, where my mom was born.
And another question, as we are looking at past information and evidence, is there not an initiative today to film or record our current generation before it is too late? I don't know if you're aware of any things that might be happening.
Our current generation, I'm not sure what the reference is to, the current generation in Cuba or in Barbados?
I am assuming in Cuba.
In Cuba. Gloria Rolando, a filmmaker, has done a marvelous film called My Footsteps in Baragua, which chronicles the journey of the West Indian migrants, and it also highlights some of their contributions to Cuba. That film, I believe it was done in the 70s or 80s. It was shown recently here at the Errol Barrow Center. So that's one aspect of documentation. But Gloria is also working on another film, which is entitled Black Cake. She had hoped to be in Barbados around this time filming, but all of the plans for bringing West Indian, Barbadian descendants for the regathering had to be scuttled because of the pandemic. But with any luck, Gloria will be able to complete her work.
Asking if there are any plans for a visit to Baragua.
Any plans? Well, I don't have any immediate plans to go to Baragua. I've been there several times and had very delightful times. I still have friends there, the siblings of my friend Yolanda Nelson, who still reside in Baragua. And it's really quite an interesting place for Barbadian visitors to see if they ever have the opportunity to go to Cuba.
And were there any archives that you were able to access with the names of immigrants to Cuba?
I was fortunate to view the ship's registers in the National Archives in Havana, and I mentioned some of them here. You saw the 1921 arrival from Panama to Cuba. And I don't know what state they're in now, if they've been digitized, but I was so afraid to touch them because of the very fragile nature of the records. But I felt quite privileged to be able to extract that information before the records disintegrated.
And how did Bajans who moved to Cuba cope with Spanish?
The usual method of operating was that while the British West Indians had this dream of returning to their home, they insisted that their children learn English, but they were also practical, and they went to Spanish school as well. So the children learned English and Spanish.
What became of Dr. Marshall's relative, Lionel Marshall?
You know, I have not been in touch with Lionel for such a long time. I have a photograph in my living room of him with me and my mom when he came to Barbados to play volleyball, and I wonder what has become of him, if he's still in Italy, where he is, but we have just lost contact, unfortunately.
Were there intermarriages between Barbadians and Cubans, and if so, what difficulties did they face?
But of course, you know, that if people are settled in a place for any appreciable period, there's going to be intermarriage. And I'm married to a Cubajan, and I guess I'm a big Cuban. But yeah, there are several instances. And I spoke about the 1st of August celebration in Barbados. It's not simply West Indian descendants who participate in this thing now, because it's become so much a part of the community. And the community has learned about Barbadian cuisine, the sorrel, the black cake, and they, when the ingredients are available, make these dishes and share with their Cuban neighbors.
Dr. Marshall, do you know whether any of the Cuban doctors or nurses in Barbados right now helping with the COVID-19 pandemic is of Barbadian descent?
I have no idea. That's a matter for investigation.
Marshall, I was lucky to visit Cuba with a group of Bajans about 20 years ago, and I loved it. Is there any plan to encourage Bajans or other Caribbeans to visit there?
Several travel agencies in Barbados have organized visits to Cuba, and not only travel agencies, Nicholas Vaughan, he took a group 2 years ago, and I spoke to the group before their departure, and they all had a wonderful time. And I imagine that once the travel restrictions are lifted and there is the airline lift, that others will be moved to visit and discover for themselves. There's another question from the cameraman or sole audience member.
You had mentioned earlier, you had talked about how the welcome was for these immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't open arms.
Yeah.
How has these ones integrated into society, their descendants and such, like, have they fully integrated into society, or is there still some form of pushback?
They are Cubans. They are fully integrated into the society, but that doesn't mean that they don't cherish their Barbadian or West Indian ancestry. They're very proud of that, in fact. 2017, I think, yes, when my book was presented at the Havana International Book Fair, I had the opportunity to visit the Caribbean Association of Cuba in Havana, and you see all of the flags from the various West Indian territories, and people telling me where my grandfather was from St. Kitts or my mother was from Barbados. And you know, so while they're very proud of being Cuban and what they have been able to accomplish in Cuba, they are still very proud of their West Indian, their Anglophone West Indian heritage.
And one more question. is there a recipe book or any plans for one that shows Bajan Cuban food?
I have no knowledge of a recipe book that shows Barbadian Cuban food. The question was, are there any plans for a recipe book of Cuban Barbadian food? Perhaps I can influence one of my friends to work on that. What I've been working on, as you mentioned in the introduction, Kay, was or is the reverse migration, and the book which I'm entitled A Return to Roots, Cubagents in Barbados, because there's a little, as I mentioned, Barbadian, Cuban, Barbadian, or Cubajan, as my husband named them, here in Barbados, and I've tried to chronicle their stories. So it's the completion of that circle of migration. Their foreparents went out and they've come back. And coincidentally enough, some of them have not received a warm welcome on the part of some Barbadians who question whether they're authentic Barbadians, despite the Barbadian accent and everything. But it's, I guess, part of human nature. But they too are also integrated into Barbadian society. I mentioned several persons in my presentation who are facilitators in the primary Spanish program. The Yearwoods, their father, teacher Yearwood, he went to Cuba and earned a living as an English teacher, and his children have come to their father's homeland and earned a living as a Spanish teacher. So there's that circle of connectivity. So I think that's it. The cameraman is putting back on his mask, so I think that signals he's not going to ask any more questions. Thank you once again, and I do appreciate your comments and your attention. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us in this year's lecture series, especially through the current challenges with COVID-19. We are very, very happy to have you join us. I'd like to report, as a matter of fact, that we've had record numbers for our online audience this afternoon, which is very heartening, given the changed date and time and the gap between this lecture and the last one we were able to do. So thank you very, very much for supporting us, and thank you very, very much for following the museum. The lecture series is a collaboration between the University of the West Indies, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and the National Cultural Foundation, as we continue to partner in taking Barbadian culture and heritage to the general public. And we would like to thank those two institutions who support us in the lecture series every year, as well as Dr. Marshall for a wonderful lecture. I'm sure she's going to enjoy looking at all the comments online after she's able to go home and relax after the lecture. Thank you once again so much for tuning in, and join us next time as we do the next lecture in the lecture series. We're unfortunately unable to give you the date at this time, but as soon as that information becomes available, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Barbados Museum, and we'll get that information out to you. Thank you so much.